Hello, in this video I'm going to talk about why a speech outline is important to complete and how to do one. So why is it always recommended that you do a speech outline? One of the first things that you want to know about public speaking is you're trying to learn what's called a conversational style of speaking. So when you give a presentation, what that really means is you want it to come across as very authentic, not rehearsed, not scripted as much as possible. Now, obviously, there's going to be parts of your speech, in fact, a lot of your presentation in a given situation that might be rehearsed. But the key is that you don't want your audience to feel like it is. Why is that? Well, think about it. When you walk into a situation and you feel like somebody is giving you sort of a canned line or it's rehearsed, how does that make you feel? Do you feel like they care about you? Do you feel like they're sincere in their intentions? If you walk into a car, you're thinking of replacing your car stereo, and you're going to get like this whole new setup. And the sales clerk walks up to you and says, "Welcome to Ed's House of Music, where the only returns we accept are smiles. How can I earn your business today?" Do you feel like the that Rick at Ed's House of Music really cares about you? Right? Probably not, right? Because you know they're just going through the motions because it's really canned. So you don't want to come across that way because it's one of the easiest ways to lose your audience when they think it's too rehearsed. So this goes to why you're doing a speech outline. So if when you're practicing a speech, you kind of have like two choices, right? You could write a speech out word for word and try to memorize the speech off that, which is certainly going to sound rehearsed. But if you do a speech outline, it's impossible for it to sound rehearsed. Okay, so this goes to just like a really simple fundamental principle, which is, one way to make sure something just doesn't happen, right? It applies to anything in life. Make it impossible to happen, right? Just eliminate the variable. This is like, I don't want to eat junk food, so I'm not going to keep it in the house, right? If it's not at your house, it's harder to eat junk food. Okay. Well, if you don't write a speech out word for word and you don't practice it word for word, it's going to be really hard to sound too scripted. You're just not going to sound scripted, right? Because it wasn't scripted. So, what an outline does is it forces you to organize your speech in a way that is not word for word. And so, therefore, and if you practice from your outline, right? Therefore, when you give the presentation, it's going to sound more authentic. It's going to sound more sincere because it just is, right? Because you didn't sort of write everything out word for word. So that is really why you're doing an outline. It's to create the outline so then you can organize your thoughts and practice from a document that isn't gonna make you sound too rehearsed and therefore insincere. So that's why we're doing this in terms of an outline. So let's talk about how to do an outline. So what I'm going to have here is I'm going to go through this sample and I'm going to talk about sort of where I grade and where I take points from. And you're going to see that I always have some students who still, for some reason, write their speech out word for word, and then they end up failing this assignment because you're going to see where the points come from. Is this really penalizes you if you write something out word for word? Because if you do that, you're really losing the point of doing a speech outline, right? And by the way, just one last note about this, like not sounding scripted when you do a speech outline. This goes back to something if you've watched my other videos, you would have heard me say that everything that you do in preparing and delivering a speech can be done to cheat, meaning make you come across as naturally smoother and better at that than you maybe just instinctively are, right? And so this is the part of speech preparation where it comes in, like, right? You have one person who prepares from a scripted word for word document and one who does an outline. The person that did it that way prepared the right way, right? They're going to come across a lot better because they're going to come across authentic and sincere. All right, so the first things that you want to have in an outline is you need to label your motivational link and your thesis statement. So if in your course they might have talked about, or in my course we talk about in speech organization and introductions, you have some sort of motivational link or attention getter. Now, a motivational link slash attention getter is basically why should your audience care about this topic right now? And again, it's not just why they should care. You need to emphasize urgency. Why should they care today, right? Because there's lots of things we care about and it doesn't move the needle. We don't do anything, right? Because it's someday, 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 right? They'll get to it. So you need to, whatever that motivational link is you're giving, you need to label it and put it there, and then your thesis statement. A thesis statement, if you remember, is one sentence that previews your topics and your topic and your three main points, right? Or your usually you want to have three main points, but three, four main points. So in this presentation, this is a student who's giving a presentation on the PALE warning system, which is the music labeling system. So their motivational link right at the beginning, right? And you'll see this is worth, for me, I have the outline assignments worth 25 points. So you'll see here, it's worth 2 points that you have labeled this motivational link. So in this case, their motivational link is that, look, this labeling system continues to influence music today, right? Like because it influences content. And by the way, the reason it influences content is because uh, what sort of lyrics you have dictates where that song can be played, right? What platforms will play it, if it has to be censored first, right? Which then influences money, right? So it does influence content and expression. So that's their motivational link. Their thesis statement, right? They say today, they've labeled that separately. That's another 2 points. Today, I would like to discuss the PALE warning system, its origins, and what its legacy is moving forward. So those are their 3 main points. Then you get into the body of the speech. So you have main point number 1 labeled, right? Roman numeral number 1. And then you have A and B, and then a transition statement. So the first thing that another like big area for points here, it's worth 4 points, is that you have to have 3 main points separately labeled. So you see the first main point here is the origins of this system. Their second main point is what is the PALE warning system, what the PALE warning system is, does, and who determines who gets the label, right? Like what's the label you get. And then the third main point, as you see very at the bottom there of your screen, is the legacy of the system. So you have to label all of these separately. You can't just put bullets, for example. You will lose points if you do that. Or just like random dots or squares, right? Now, why do you have to number them? Because if you're practicing with your outline and you lose your place and you look down and you just see a bunch of bullets or you just see a bunch of paragraphs, right? It's not as easy to find your place. If they're numbered, you can quickly see number 1, 2, 3 and figure out where you were. So the numbers are there to help you. It's a requirement for a reason. So you have to label all 3 main points. Now, within each main point, you have to have at least every main point has to have 2 subpoints, which is A and B. So if you've never done an outline before, when you see something indented here and it says like A and B, so in this first main point, they're talking about the history of the system. And they have subpoint A, which is that one of the reasons we got here in terms of a labeling system is that society's views on music began to change. And essentially we had this period of time where people started to really get concerned about music lyrics, right? And there was more of an outcry that we need to do something about it. So particularly with lyrics that they saw, in this case, he's talking about sort of like people thought were satanical, right? Or sexually charged or violent or glorifying or emphasizing substance abuse, right? So people got really concerned about that. And then there were certainly like flashpoint albums. So in this case, subpoint B, he talks about Prince's album 1999, right? And so you have to have 2 subpoints, A and B, for each main point. And you'll see here that's worth another 4 points. Now, why do you have to have 2 subpoints? So let's just say in this first main point, they only had 1 subpoint. Let's say they only talked about the album 1999. Right? So they say, well, I'm going to talk to you about the history of the system. And then they say, look, we had these flagship albums. So in other words, these flashpoints, right, where that really drew attention. And one of them was the album 1999. So if they only have the 1 subpoint, what's the problem? Well, the problem is that you're not really talking about the origins of the labeling system because we don't have a music labeling system just because of Prince's album 1999, right? You're only giving one example. So you're not really covering the topic, right? So if you only talk about Prince's album 1999, your main point is no longer the history of the labeling system, like how did this start? Your main point is how the album 1999 played a role because you only talk about the album 1999, right? That's all you talk about. So if you can only come up with one subpoint, that means you got 2 choices, right? You got to pick which horse you're going to ride, so to speak. Your first choice, you need to change the main point, and it could be so. If you're only going to talk about 1999, what you could do is say, "Look, we got a music labeling system for a variety of reasons, and one of them was certainly certain albums that drew a lot of attention, and one of those was the album 1999. So let's talk about that further." And then you need to have 2 examples from that album, right, as to why it in particular drew attention. So in other words, you got to If you only come up with one subpoint, you got to make that the main point and then come up with two subpoints for that, right? Or you need to come up with another example, which they did here, which is talking about just society in general being concerned about lyrics. So I will look to see that you have two subpoints. You have to label them A and B because, again, if you lose your place and you're practicing from your outline, it helps you remember, oh, yeah, I was on B, right? Or where is the second subpoint, etc. So you do have to label them. You have to have a transition labeled. So you'll see here it says transition, which now look, transitions are how you move from one main point to the next main point, and you have to have these labeled. This is worth 4 points out of 25. You have to have these labeled between each main point. So from your first to your second, from your second to your third, typically. And in reality, you're probably always going to have a transition statement. Or when we talk about delivery, if you see my videos on delivery, or maybe if you've taken another speech class, I've talked about how you can have a transition statement. Sometimes you can actually ask the audience a question as a transition. So if the answer leads them to the next point. So if I said, who would like to shave 10 hours off their work week, right? And just by a show of hands, who could use an extra free 10 hours a week? Who would enjoy that? And of course, people are going to say yes. And I could say, well, great. Let me talk about my next point is going to talk about how this is going to save you time, right? It's going to simplify your life. So you can have transition statements. You can ask the audience a question, which the answer leads to the next main point. But whatever statement you're going to use, you need to label it there and state it. So I'm going to look for that. And look, as you go through delivery in my class or in another speech class, they're certainly going to talk about how there's other ways to do a transition that you can like layer on top of that. For example, switching visual aids at that point, or physical movement across the room during transitions to create that orienting response and refocus your audience, right? Bring them back in. So you can obviously incorporate a lot of things in here, but I want to make sure you labeled your transition statement. So something else that's going on here, if we look at the second main point, which is what is the pale warning system? They say what the pale warning is, does, and who determines who gets the label. So they're talking about that. Now, if you have a subpoint here, so they're talking about National Public Radio, and what their information is here. And if you want to even go into a subpoint of that, that's where you see they've indented into one here. You don't necessarily have to do that, go to that level in depth in my course, but some classes do that. I do not have you necessarily, you do not have to cite your sources within the body of this outline, but some people will do that, sometimes based on the format of the outline they're doing, or some people use it as a nice like sort of practice technique, which is if I have to cite the source during my speech and I'm practicing from my outline, it's easy if I have those sources there, right? So if you want to cite them within the body of your speech, you can, although it's not something that I require for my courses. So we go into down to another transition, right? Third main point. Then we get to your conclusion. Now, what am I going to look for on your conclusion? That you have a review statement. So again, if your course or if you've seen my videos on speech organization, we talk about in a conclusion, you have a review statement, which is basically your thesis statement in past tense. So this is one sentence that reviews your topic and main points. Once again, today we talked about the pale warning system. We looked at its how we got here, right? Its implications moving forward, whatever your main points are, and you just summarize that in one sentence. Your motivational link, right? This is another opportunity. I mean, hopefully you've gone back to that throughout your speech. This is another opportunity to bring that up again, right? Or sort of like your final thought moment, so to speak, right? Like, what is the thing here that you want to leave them with that's impactful? But I'm also going to look for, have you labeled to tell them where to go for more information? You always want to tell people where to go for more information. If it's an informative presentation and you've accomplished your job of making them care about the topic or want to learn more, tell them where to go. And even if it's persuasive, tell them either where to go for more information or what action step to take next, right? There's a variety of action steps you can have somebody do when it comes to a speech, is like some sort of like to get them going, right? There's different research on when it comes to persuasion that if a person takes an initial step, they're likely to keep going, right? They're more likely to follow through. So you always want to include like where to go for more information or some kind of action step. And I'm going to look to see, do you have that labeled on your outline? And then your works cited page. Your works cited page has to be on a separate page, right? You put this down on a separate page. You need to title it works cited, and then you have to have your sources cited there. In my courses, I have you cite with MLA format. You'll have to check with your course if they're doing something different, but I prefer MLA format. I am not, you want to cite this as best you can. I'm going to look to make sure that these are MLA formatted correctly. If they're not, as long as I can find the source, I am more lenient than maybe some other instructors, since we're focused on public speaking here and not necessarily are you getting the MLA citations correct. But obviously it needs to be done well enough where I can actually find the sources and within reason, uh, as close as possible to correct MLA formatting. So that's a speech outline. If you look at this outline is only 2 pages of content and then 1 page of a works cited page, right? So it's not a lot of stuff. And then what you can do is once you have that outline built, is you can just practice from it. And by practicing from it instead of a word for word outline, you're not only going to sound less scripted, but the other advantage of practicing from it is by doing the outline, an outline beyond being not word for word is it's giving you a visual reference here where you can look at and quickly spot where you were in the speech. So it's very easy to practice from an outline. And I've even seen people sometimes just take their outline, shrink the font down to like 10 and print it out and cut it and put that on their note cards. Like I've seen people do that sometimes just as their note cards as well. So that's the outline. I require in my classes that you turn in a speech outline for every speech except for some of the initial ones that we do, such as an impromptu speech, something like that, or a speech of introduction. For those, I don't require an outline. But when you do informative and persuasive, the other, what we call platform presentations, where you have visual aids and all these other dynamics involved, you do a speech outline. They're always due at the same time of presentations if it's an online class, or the first day of presentations if we are meeting over several days or these speeches are being done over several days. All right, hope you found that helpful, and I will see you guys hopefully in the next video.